Thank you to the music group. Okay, so now we are going to hear the story of the temple. And I'm going to tell you this story in more than one way. First of all, I'm going to tell you the story in historical terms. I'm going to tell you the story of actually what happens to these structures and so on. But then I'm going to come on and I want to tell you the story from a theological point of view. But we'll talk about what that means, and I'll show you what that means in a few minutes. Let me start by telling you the story historically. That's where we're kind of heading, but that's not where it starts. Okay. So as we have already said, so I've got a kind of timeline along the bottom, which is definitely not to scale, but it's trying to be indicative. So as we have already said, the very first physical temple that exists is the tabernacle. And there's a bit of a picture of it, and now you can start to see that sort of low-ish curtain around the whole thing. You can see the altar. I hope you can kind of see that. You can see the altar here. This is one of the chief altars. This is the censer for burning incense. And here is the most holy place where the ark resides. And that thing over the top is the thing that might or might not be made of sea cows, but we were not going to worry too much about that. So that is the tabernacle. And at this point, this is the point at which it's created and inaugurated at Sinai, and then as the people travel for 40 years before they eventually enter the land, it travels with them. And as I mentioned, there is an elaborate system of instructions for how to dismantle the tabernacle, who's allowed to carry what, and how to re-erect it. And it's been really interesting, actually, as I've been studying this in the book of Numbers. Because the tents and things, they become the wrappers for the holy items. And it tells you the colour of the things that are wrapped up. And the ark itself is wrapped in, I think its final colour, it's wrapped in multiple layers, and I think its final colour is blue. And that's the only one that is that colour. So even there, you've got red and blue and gold, I think, and even when it was on the move, you could tell that this was a holy thing. And as I mentioned already, the ark has got its carrying poles so that nobody touches it. So this is a portal between heaven and earth, and you don't stroll into a portal because you don't know what will happen to you. You do know what will happen to you if you do, and it's not going to be a happy outcome. Okay, so that's the tabernacle. So the people of God have a tabernacle which travels with them for those 40 years. The ark goes ahead of them into the conquest of the land of Canaan. And for quite a long while, even after they arrive in the land of Canaan, they are still worshipping in a tabernacle. But eventually, King David comes along, and King David says to himself, should I be living in a glorious palace of stone and marble when God is still living in a tent? I think I will build a house for him. And he consults the prophet Nathan. And this was not Nathan's most glorious moment, because he consults Nathan, and Nathan says, off the cuff, he says, it's a great idea. I think God will be really pleased about that. Goes home, goes to bed, and God speaks to him at that night and says, actually, I don't want David to do any such thing. You better go back and tell the king you got it wrong. So David has to come back, and the next day he re-enters the king's presence. And God makes, through Nathan, a remarkable promise to David. And interestingly, it has a kind of pun at its heart. And the pun, of course, in Hebrew originally, but the pun works in English as well. How about that? So you see, the word that Nathan has from God for David is, thanks very much, but no thanks. I don't want you to build me a house, but instead I will make a house for you. And the pun is, because house is one of the ways that the temple is referred, the house of the Lord is one of the terms used for the temple, and God is saying, no thanks, I don't want you to build me a house. But I will make a house for you. And think House of Hanover, House of Tudor. I will make a dynasty for you. And the pun works in English as well as Hebrew. How about that? It's the only place I know where that's true. So God says, thank you, David. I applaud your instinct to want to do it, but it won't be you who does it. It'll be your son. Instead, I will establish in you an everlasting dynasty. We're not really going to consider the dynasty thing much today because it's not really part of the temple theme directly, but just notice it because actually at the end of our time together this morning, or in a few minutes, I will just refer back to it briefly. In the telling of this in Chronicles, we get a little bit more information given. Do you know why David is not allowed to build the temple? Too much blood. He shed too much blood. And Solomon, his son, so David basically establishes the kingdom, and there's a lot of fighting involved. Solomon inherits that and benefits from that, and really is involved in very little military action. Interestingly, his name, Shlomo, is related to the Hebrew word for peace. And Solomon has many, many flaws, but at least one thing is he's not really a man of battle. And so it is Solomon who is permitted to build the temple. And this is a kind of cutaway design of what that temple looked like. You can read about that in both the books of Kings and in Chronicles, and you can read about the size and the magnitude of this. It's interesting to me, I did a study on this recently, that the building of the tabernacle was funded by free will offerings. And Moses says to the people, we're going to create the tabernacle as God's instructed. If you'd like to, bring me your jewelry, bring me your valuables, and we'll use that for the tabernacle. And he quickly has to put a stop to things. He quickly has to say, no, we've got enough, stop. And it interests me a lot that the people who were slow to give don't get the privilege of contributing to the tabernacle. But that's how the tabernacle was funded. Temple is not funded in that way at all. And things have already, in my view, started to go badly wrong, really. Solomon has instituted a system of enforced, corvée, conscripted labour, and he has instituted a harsh system of taxation. And this is how the temple is funded. There is some money comes out of the royal treasury as well, but there is substantial taxation on the people and forced labour, certainly enslavement of all immigrants, and probably a system of forced labour in rotation of Israelites as well. Anyway, he purchases lots of cedar, he purchases marble. The great blocks that make up the temple are not dressed on site because the site itself is already holy and it's not to be kind of disturbed, I suppose, by the sound of masonry. So they are dressed elsewhere and then brought dressed, ready for erection. And it is a glorious thing. Interestingly, I always take the word interestingly when I use it under advisement. I find things interesting that not other people don't necessarily. But interestingly to me, the temple takes 7 years to complete. And 7 is a very significant number in Scripture. And given now that we have already started to understand that the temple is what we call a microcosm, it's a working model of the heavens and earth themselves, then the fact that the temple takes 7 years, when Genesis 1 talks about the heavens and the earth being created in 7 days, is no coincidence. And so both the tabernacle and the temple actually have kind of creation imagery in the description of their erection. I haven't got time to show it all to you, but you might like to have a look at that for yourself. So Solomon takes 7 years to erect the temple. Interestingly, again, he takes substantially longer to build his palace. Now, you might say, well, that's because his priority was the temple and he put all his effort into that. I don't think that is what is going on. I think he puts more energy, more effort, and his palace is absolutely, obscenely magnificent. Have a look at that for yourself. So that's Solomon's temple, and we've looked at the basic structure of it already. Then we're going to have a number of years where the temple is going to be variously kind of neglected, fall a bit into disrepair, perhaps stripped of its jewels, of its valuables at times. Other times it gets renovated. We're not going to go into all the details of that. Hezekiah is quite interesting, a later king. Hezekiah enlarges the kind of plateau on which the temple is built. The temple is built on a hill, not quite at the top of a hill. And Hezekiah kind of creates a plateau to enlarge the kind of broad temple area. And that matters because in a minute we're going to see a bit more about that plateau. Okay, so Solomon builds the temple. It gets various renovations at different times. Now, the covenant, you see, these themes are all linked and we can't disentangle them wholly. The covenant that God made with his people at Sinai had a deal. And the deal was, I will be your God, you'll be my people. You live like you're my people, and you will live forever in this land. But if you do not live like you're my people, then ultimately you will be evicted from this place, and you'll be conquered by enemies. And after David and after Solomon, well, during David and Solomon, and then continuing in the kings that follow, things get worse and worse, and the people become more and more unfaithful. And the prophets are sent to warn them and remind them. Prophets really are, the pre-exilic prophets are covenant enforcers. They're just basically saying, remember the covenant, remember the covenant. So they keep being reminded, but they don't pay any lasting attention. And so ultimately, the enemies that God had warned do indeed invade the land. And first of all, the great superpower of Assyria comes, and Assyria conquers from the north, and it takes, the nation is split by now, and it takes the northern nation into captivity, conquers quite a lot of the southern nation as well, but doesn't take Jerusalem, surrounds Jerusalem, but then retreats. After Assyria, the next great superpower is Babylon. And Babylon inherits, as it were, all that Assyria had conquered, and then ultimately sets its sight on Jerusalem itself. And there's a kind of two-stage conquest of Jerusalem. The first time that they conquer it, they deport the leading citizens, if you like, but they leave it as a functioning city. The plan is that they put a puppet king in, and the idea is that the city will pay its dues to Babylon and will continue as a vassal state. But they rebel, and so then Babylon comes in absolutely crushing force. It besieges the city, very long, harsh, brutal siege, and then ultimately it conquers the city, and it destroys the city, including the temple. And that picture there is of it's of the great processional way in Babylon, it's got these highly glazed tiles with lions all the way along. It's as part of the kind of great propaganda, really, of that empire. And part of the second wave of the conquest of Jerusalem was the deportation of most of the people. And many of them would have come to Babylon and would have come along with that processional way. And they would have been blinded by the sun glinting off these highly glazed tiles, and they would absolutely know that they had been conquered. But they have watched their temple being torn down and put to the flame in the meantime. Okay. So the people are in exile as per all the warnings that God has sent over the years. But superpowers come and superpowers go. And just as Assyria fell to Babylon, Babylon falls to Persia. And Persia has a different foreign policy. And under the king Cyrus, Cyrus makes a proclamation. You can actually find a copy of it, an original copy of it, if you like, in the British Museum. I meant to put a picture up of it, actually, but you just have to go to the British Museum and have a look. It's called the Cyrus Cylinder. And it's recorded in the scriptures, it's recorded in this ancient cylinder in the British Museum. And the deal is, all the conquered peoples, it's not just God's people, it's many other nations as well. All the conquered peoples can return to their own home, and they can set up their own systems of government again, providing, they pay their dues and I'm the real boss. And so he makes this deal. Nehemiah and then Ezra hear about it. It was the other way around, sorry. And they come back. They lead a group of real pioneers, I would say. I don't know if you've ever opened up those books and seen the list of names and then flicked the page. Do you know what? Don't do that. Read those names. Those were men of faith who chose to leave what had now become quite a comfortable life in exile, and chose to come back to, it's a bit like moving to the Wild West, There's no effective system of government, there's no agricultural infrastructure, they were real pioneers, and they came back to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city. And it says that the old men and some of those pioneers were old men who remembered Solomon's temple. And it says that as they dug the foundations and they mapped it out, they wept. Because, they were joyful because they were about to restart the temple, but the old men wept because they remembered the glory of the former one, and this one was just a shadow of it. much smaller. And it says that they couldn't distinguish the cries of joy from the weeping. So they rebuild the temple. And what you can see there is you can see the kind of platform that Hezekiah has built on the hillside there. And the temple itself is this tiny structure here. Okay. And if you go on this website, Rittmeyer Archaeological Design, then it shows the temple at different points. So you can actually kind of toggle between them and compare the size of the temples. It's quite because it does it sort of from the same, geographical place, as it were. So it's quite interesting to look at that. So that's the rebuilding of the second temple. That's called the second temple. Then we have a long period of political turmoil, really. But ultimately, we get King Herod, much later. And Herod embarks on what we might call a vanity project. Herod was no devout Jew, but he knew that the people loved the temple, and so he embarked on a huge building project so it's not a third temple, it's still the second temple, but it's the second temple glitzed up and made much bigger and more substantial. And I've got a very short video which I found, which I thought might explain this for us. You might enjoy this, I thought. Thank you. It's probably going to come in with an advert first, so ignore that.
Herod's temple. King Herod wanted to create for the Jews a temple more magnificent than Solomon's, and by doing this, he would perpetuate his name and secure Jerusalem as his capital and one of the greatest cities in the world. So 23 BC, 7 years after Augustus had confirmed Herod as king of Judea, he takes on the task. Herod was one of the greatest architects in history, and for a project this great, he employed 18,000 skilled workers. The Jews agreed only because Herod said that his skilled craftsmen would train 1,000 of their priests to work on special religious areas of the temple. The foundations of the old temple were removed, and the work had begun. Herod greatly enlarged the platform, and for the temple, he used the basic floor plan of the Temple of Solomon, but its architecture was Hellenistic and Roman. He doubled the height of the Holy of Holies building and adorned every side of the main temple building with heavy gold plate. Josephus said it achieved magnificence beyond compare. He also said that at sunrise it shimmered with the utmost brilliance and dazzled the eye like rays of the sun. Herod used massive white stone blocks that were approximately 40 feet long by 18 feet wide and weighed hundreds of tons each. The construction of the temple was completed in only a year and a half, but the finished work lasted until 63 AD. The temple of Herod was the temple that is mentioned throughout the entire New Testament, and the one Jesus referred to as my Father's house. Its location was the same as Solomon's, on Mount Moriah at the east side of Jerusalem. Just outside the eastern gate was the Valley of Jehoshaphat, or the Kidron Valley, and then across the valley was the Mount of Olives. The temple was made up of several large courtyards, each on a higher terrace and accessible by ladder. Thank you. We'll have a look at it for yourself if you're interested, because I think it's quite the full video is quite interesting. So that is, am I back on? Yes. So that's
Herod's temple. And as he said there, although the temple itself was kind of rebuilt in quite a short period of time, the actual greater building project lasted for a very long time and was still in progress in the time of the Gospels. And you may remember that the disciples speaking to Jesus about that. We'll touch on that, I think, later on today. But Herod's temple, as you know, is not there today. Because in AD 70, the Romans this time, superpowers come and superpowers go, the Romans this time came and crushed Jerusalem in much the same way that they had crushed, the Babylonians had crushed Jerusalem so many years before. And if you go to Rome today, if you go to Rome today and go to the Forum, you can see the Arch of Titus, which is a victory arch celebrating the victory over the Jews in Judea, in Jerusalem. And on that arch contains details of the plundering of the temple. And you can see here the sacred items being taken from the temple. And this is on the Arch of Titus. If you go to Masada, has anyone here been to Masada? Oh, quite a lot of you. So Masada was the last stronghold of the rebels against the Romans. And if you go and stand there and look down, you can still see where the Roman armies encamped as they besieged that kind of mountain fortress. It's chilling, really, and that's a reflection of the might and force that led to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Absolutely catastrophic event in Jewish history. So here's the kind of whole story overall, as I say, not entirely to scale. That's the historical facts about the temple, but I want to tell you the same story, fairly in shorter order, through a theological lens, actually 3 theological lenses, fairly quickly. Because this helps us to understand what God is about and what is happening in theological terms rather than just in historical and kind of architectural terms. So, let's start by talking about presence. So we've been speaking about the presence of the Lord all the way through, and we've said that the temple is the means of... that showed up much better on my laptop than it does here, but I'll read it to you in a minute. Sorry about that. The temple is the means of mediating the presence of God. It's the portal between heaven and earth. So, back to Sinai, back to the first temple, apart from the cosmic one. And I've referred to this already, but let me read this to you. Here's this theophany at Sinai, the presence of God at the top of the mountain. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning, as well as thick cloud on the mountain, and the blast of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln while the whole mountain shook violently. So there's the theophany, the presence of God at the top of, this one, wasn't it? The top of Mount Sinai. Okay. Now, we're going to see something similar at the inauguration of the tabernacle. So what happens when the tabernacle is consecrated? And we heard this read to us earlier, then the cloud covered, the cloud of the glory of God covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So they've done all this preparation work, they've got their artisans and their embroiderers and everything else, they've created this thing, and they hold this moment. And sometimes we speak about Moses consecrating the tabernacle. Of course, it's God who consecrates the tabernacle, really, but they conduct this ceremony. And as part of that, in a way that I think they had not anticipated, God comes down in this majestic act. And interestingly to me, the function of the tabernacle is subverted at that very moment, because Moses is all there, ready to be the top dog guy, has to retreat, because the presence of God is so powerful. That's the consecration of the tabernacle. Now, what happens at the consecration of Solomon's temple? Listen to this. When Solomon had ended his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house, and the people fell on their faces and worshipped. Exactly the same thing happens. They've had the artisans in, they've had their stone cutters and their wood cutters, and they've created this thing, and they begin their act of worship, and whoop, God comes down in glory. And do you notice what happens? The priests have to retreat, because for the moment, the presence of God is so overwhelming that they cannot be there. The presence is where God lives. And if you asked any observant Israelite, I think, in those days, who are you and how do you know? They would say, I'm one of God's people, and I know because he lives there. That's his throne. Okay. Now, the conquest, the demolition of the temple, the demolition of the temple is reflected by the prophet Ezekiel. And Ezekiel should have been a priest. But he had been taken in the first wave of deportees, and so he is hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, grieving the fact he's come to his priestly age. He's come to the age of 30, and he ought to be in the temple doing priestly things, and he's hundreds of miles away, not being a priest. But at that time, he has a vision from God. And this vision is absolutely devastating. Because let me read it to you. So he sees a vision in the opening chapters of Ezekiel. He sees this really difficult to understand vision, but don't be too literal with it. And it basically shows God on a portable throne. So think about this throne. It is a theophany. We've got fire and smoke and lightning and thunder, but this throne has wheels. Okay. And listen to this. As he watches, then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stopped above the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and rose up from the earth. They stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. So here's this pregnant moment. He's seen the glory of the Lord lift. We know it came down at the time of Solomon. We've seen the glory of the Lord lift up, and it's kind of hovering in this terrifying, pregnant moment. Next chapter. Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the Lord God of Israel was above them, and the glory of the Lord ascended from the middle of the city and stopped on the mountain. He sees this vision of the glory of the Lord lifting up and departing the temple, and that is absolutely devastating. And then they get the news. The news travels with the next wave of exiles. The temple is destroyed. And this is crushing, because the temple is the only means by which humans can encounter God. It is the means of forgiveness. It is the place of revelation. It is the place of the presence of God. And it has been destroyed. It is no more. I've already told you that they come back and they build another temple. Listen to what happens at the building of that temple. The people of the Lord, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs and stuff. Then they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their courses for the service of God. And what hasn't happened? The glory has not come back. And we only notice that if we start to read, if we read big, if we read the big sweep. Because read it alone, it sounds fine. But read it in reflection of Sinai and the consecration of the tabernacle, consecration of the first temple. And there is a deafening, echoing absence of God coming in power. What's that about? So that's the first way of telling that story theologically, even more briefly. And we've kind of touched on this already. But the temple is a means of managing the threat that the presence of God represents. And so at Sinai, Moses is told more than once, go and put up a fence, go and tell the people, warn them, they must not come onto the mountain because they will be consumed if they are. The temple is the means of managing that threat. At the consecration of the tabernacle and the consecration of the priests, Aaron and his sons, at one point they offer fire. They offer a sacrifice, and fire from the Lord comes out and consumes it, and all the people go, "Oh, wow!" And then Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, think, "Oh, this is a good thing. This is great. I like this. Makes me feel pretty good." This is me slightly reading in, but I think this is pretty much what the subtext is. So they then rock up and, we're going to offer a sacrifice as well. But they've just done it their own way. They haven't done it the way that God has commanded. And fire comes out from the Lord and consumes them. The temple is a means of managing the utterly threatening presence of God. God's presence is both absolutely desirable, but also totally threatening. And the temple is the portal by which that is managed. A bit later on, and I referred to this briefly in the little spoken word piece I did earlier, a bit later on, David is bringing the ark. The ark got lost for a while. David is bringing the ark back up to the sanctuary. And there's a guy called Uzzah who's superintending the move of the ark. He's forgotten all the instructions that the book of Numbers tells about how this is to be managed. And they put it on an ox cart, and he's strolling along beside it. And the ox catch their foot on something, and they stumble, and he puts out his hand to steady it. And he's struck down because you don't do that. The temple is about managing the threat that the presence of God inherently contains. And then the third way of telling the story is to look at the way the temple becomes corrupted. Begins with the Sinai temple, because when Moses comes down after spending 40 days on the mountain in the presence of God, they've made a covenant, and the covenant has been broken already because the people have made a golden calf and started bowing down to that. There's the first sign of the corruption of the temple. Then move on to the story of the tabernacle, and we might think, we could use others, but we might think about the sons of Eli the priest. And the sons of Eli had not learned from Nadab and Abihu because they were also, they were using their position for their own benefit. They were helping themselves to the sacrifices that God's faithful people were bringing. They were abusing the women who served in the sanctuary as well. And ultimately, they die in battle. They die young, and they don't take up the reins, really, of the priesthood. This is a story. I won't read the whole thing to you, but I mentioned Assyria, how Assyria came and conquered much of the northern nation, and much of the north of the southern nation. And one of the kings, Ahaz, goes to visit the Assyrian king, because now he's his overlord. And he goes to visit him, and when he's there, he's in Damascus, and while he's there, he rather sees an altar he rather likes. And this is a pagan altar, we understand, okay? And Ahaz looks at this altar and goes, oh, that's a bit nice, actually. I wouldn't mind one of those back home in my place. So he gets a sketch made, and he gets a sketch sent back home, and he sends it to the priest, and he says, make one of these up, please. And they remove the altar of the Lord, and they move it to the side in order to put this pagan altar in the temple of God. And then we could go on to think about the ways that the prophets speak about the corruption of worship. Hosea says, God says through Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Or God through Isaiah says, the abundance of your sacrifices, what are they to me? Read that as Isaiah 1. It's this sort of jaw-dropping chapter. Read Isaiah 58. It says the same sort of thing. And then I will read you this one. This is Ezekiel's vision again. So remember, Ezekiel's had this vision of the glory of God in the temple, then lifting up and departing from the temple. And there's this ironic moment while this departure is in action, and as God has kind of lifted up, and he's kind of, almost shall I go or shall I stay sort of idea. And then we hear this. Mortal, do you see what they are doing? He sees these people. In his vision, he sees these men in the temple. Do you see what they are doing, the great abominations that the house of Israel are committing here, to drive me far from my sanctuary? Go and look at the vile abominations that they are committing here. So I went in and looked, and portrayed on the wall all around were all kinds of creeping things and loathsome animals and all the idols of the house of Israel. And before them stood 70 elders of the house of Israel with a censer in their hand. So they're offering incense to other gods. And then... And he said to me, they say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. And then he takes him further into the temple. And there he sees 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces towards the east, prostrating themselves to the sun. So here's this vision Ezekiel has. And the presence of the Lord has lifted, and it is hovering over the temple. And all these men are so busy worshipping, they've got their back to what's going on, and they're not noticing the great catastrophic drama that is unfolding in their very midst. And almost finally, the temple corruption continues in the time between the testaments. High priest appointments stop being hereditary. It was always supposed to be a high priest of the tribe of Levi, and it became open to bribery. It became political appointments. Throughout the Old Testament, warnings are given that God will visit. Don't think maiden aunt coming for cucumber sandwiches, think Ofsted. That God will visit. God will visit his temple, and he will judge it. Malachi. You'll know the first part of this. I wonder if you know the second part. I will send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before you. And the Lord whom you seek will come suddenly to his temple. But who can endure the day of his coming? He is like a refiner's fire. So this is where the Old Testament ends. Another cliffhanger for us. Okay. Remember that promise that God made David? I will give you an enduring house. At the end of the Old Testament, there is no son of David on the throne. The presence of God has lifted and has departed from the temple and has not come back. The temple is corrupt, and there is this pending warning, threat, if you like, that God will visit it and judge it. And also, if anybody really thinks about this question, although I'm not sure that's necessarily in their mind, but who will enter the cosmic sanctuary? Remember that question mark I put earlier? These are the unanswered questions as the last author of the Old Testament puts down his pen. And this afternoon we will pick that up where we leave off now. Thank you.